It looks like I got the go-ahead and get started. So first of all, I just want to thank you for inviting me, and I don't know for being such a great host. Now I guess I have to actually do something. Presuming drinks and food is great. Microphone, stay close to that? Okay. My training, actually, even though Dan and I are the same age, I was actually Dan's student in graduate school and I was enrolled in a clinical psychology program. It was a very unique program at the time in that even though it was a clinical psychology program, doctoral program, you also chose an experimental subdiscipline that you also took courses in, had to do separate comps, and Dan was my advisor because of some mutual interests. So I've always thought of myself as both a personality/social psychologist and a clinical psychologist. So for me, I've always been interested in the implications of social cognitive personality theory for clinical practice. And one thing that we say is often is clinicians implicitly recognize this, is that our clients come in with personalities. Here's a picture of some kids. This was taken in Paris in 1963. It was a puppet show, and this shows the precise moment in the puppet show where the dragon is slain. And you can, same situation, and you can see the diversity of reactions to the same situation, and that's what we mean by personality, right? On the left, we see a kid who's kind of overstimulated, so we see looks of horror, but obviously the kid in the middle there is experiencing exultation, joy. But with clients, sometimes what we see are long-standing patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that contribute to really significant distress and dysfunction. And frankly, sometimes those long-standing patterns are the psychopathology. Other times we diagnose them with other conditions, but it's clear that long-standing ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving, personality, is contributing. So as clinicians, we have to conceptualize the role of personality in contributing to clinical distress and dysfunction. So for the first day, what I'm going to do is kind of talk about the importance of assessing personality in clinical case conceptualization. This is where we develop models of our clients' distress and dysfunction and try to figure out what's going on so we have a model of kind of what to do therapeutically. Unfortunately, I think the current practice of personality assessment in clinical psychology is we're in a state of crisis. I think there's no larger gap that exists in clinical practice between science and practice than it exists right now in terms of in clinical personality assessment. So I'll say a little bit about that. I think social cognitive theory, and in particular Dan's Kappa model, really has a lot of promise for a way forward, for a way of assessing the person that's more valid and maybe more useful clinically. And so I'll talk about that path forward. Dan and his work, in addition to kind of providing a more principled way of differentiating what you should measure in personality, is also, with some colleagues of his, described principles of personality assessment. So he's provided a roadmap, but there's still work to do, I think. So I'll talk about an example of that in terms of measuring some of the beliefs, goals, moral standards that clients have. How do we do that? How do we assess it? And I'll talk about assessing self-schemata and the gap between the current scientific understanding of the structure of self-schemata and how they're assessed commonly in clinical practice with some work that we've done in our lab developing a new measure of self-schemata that we think is more in line, more content valid, more in line with how most researchers conceptualize self-schemata. Tomorrow, though, just to give you a preview here, day 2, what I want to do is describe in detail. This is a method that we've been working on in our clinic for the last 8-9 years. Used to be at University of Wyoming, now the director of a psychology clinic at Washington State University, where I'm also a professor. We have a clinical doctoral program, really good program. We get hundreds of applicants, accept 6 to 8 students a year. fully funded. They go 5 years through a doctoral training program, and then their 6th year they do a clinical internship. And then our psychology training clinic is all the students during their 3rd, 4th, 5th years do a primary training practicum in the clinic. And we've been, with clients, developing, trying to apply Dan's Kappa model along with the personality assessment principles that he's described, and developing a specific procedure for assessing personality that represents a novel personality assessment approach that's a social cognitive approach. And so we'll be talking about how to assess personality structures. By that I mean relatively enduring components in the person that exist within the person and that have causal influence, that actually influence the way we think, feel, and behave. We'll talk about a procedure for identifying situations in which those personality structures are activated. We then have clients sort, with the clinician's help, sorting those situations into functionally equivalent situation categories or response classes. So even though you have 2 situations that on the surface look different, for that individual they think, feel, and behave similarly in those different situations. So we talk about that as a functionally equivalent class of situations. And then the next step is to identify how clients think, feel, and behave in those functionally equivalent situation classes. And then finally, mapping personality structures to these if-then personality processes. And I'll illustrate that with at least one case illustration, maybe 2, depending on how much time I have. So that's where we're headed tomorrow. Ultimately, what those models do, that personality assessment approach does, is generate models of the clients. So here's one situation for one client that we had in our clinic, and this was when he reflected on his past. And there are a lot of situations that are listed there. He's reflecting on not speaking up in his class seminar. Another situation was reflecting on not treating his past girlfriend as well as he thought he should have. Another situation is reflecting on not following through on job applications. And then he also identified a situation of not exerting enough effort, putting enough effort into his art. He was somebody who liked to paint. In each of those situations, even though they're different situations, he had very similar appraisals, very similar cognitions, and they're listed there. It could have been different. I missed my chance. I should have done X, Y, Z. It was my fault. The future looks threatening, and those thoughts would be associated with feelings of regret, sadness, some fear. And in these situations, he tended to ruminate, to really think over and over about these past situations that didn't go well for him, urges to give up, withdraw, and engage in a lot of self-criticism. Our procedure is trying to explain why he thinks, feels, and behaves the way he does in those situations. So we come up with models that try to somewhat dynamically represent how different personality structures in the client are interacting with each other to influence these personality signatures, these personality processes. So that's where we're ultimately headed. I'm not going to be spending a lot of time on that today, but tomorrow, again, we'll go more in depth into that. But today, going to be talking about some work I think we still need to do to be able to fully implement social cognitive personality assessment principles into clinical personality assessment. Clinical case conceptualizations are a core basic clinical skill. We consider it a clinical competency that we try to train all of our students to do. And I tell our students, begin nomothetic. If you've got somebody walking in the door that meets criteria for major depressive disorder, in session 1 or 2, you don't have a personalized idiographic conceptualization of the client yet. But you do know some things. You know some things about depression in general. And we have our students take a psychopathology course the very first semester where they learn about the current science of depression, generalized anxiety disorder. And that science informs psychotherapies. And if you look on the American Psychological Association website, apa.org, Division 12, they list by diagnosis psychological treatments that in randomized controlled studies have been shown to have support for being effective for those conditions. And there's actually, it's a great site. You can actually find resources for clients on there, videos demonstrating the therapy manuals, everything else. And that's where you start. And it's reasonable to do that, right? Because we know for depression, for example, there's been a lot of research showing that depressed folks, as a group, when you compare them to other groups, appear to engage in fewer response contingent positive reinforcement, fewer behaviors that are going to possibly lead to positive reinforcement. You know, you have to do things to experience connection with others, to experience a sense of competency. And it requires a behavior on your part to do that. What we see in depression is often clients, enacting fewer of those behaviors, and that's been shown to maintain and contribute to depressive episodes in general. Now, I have had some depressed clients that don't show that. They're very engaged in their lives. So this is, it's a general model of depression, and for most people it's true, but not for everyone. Also, again, in general, we see that people diagnosed with major depressive disorder, it's as if they're viewing the world through glasses that are dirty. And everything they look at, including themselves, the world, others, looks negative, looks bad. And that's a cognitive process that is dysfunctional and maintains and contributes to the depressive episode. Lots of studies showing that. And based on that science, we have treatments that target those processes. We have treatments that try to activate the person behaviorally, try to get them to schedule activities where they potentially could experience some mastery, experience some connection with another human being. We schedule those and we check in with the client to see how they went. And in general, those work. Those interventions work for people. And for these dysfunctional cognitive processes, we teach clients to monitor situations that they're experiencing depressed moods in, and to capture what's going through their minds in those moments, and to reappraise situations, to engage in some effortful cognitive processing to really question whether there's evidence to support the initial thoughts that are automatically coming to mind, which are typically overgeneralized and negative. But again, based on those theories, we do cognitive behavioral therapy, and we do behavioral activation, we do cognitive restructuring, and for 50 to 70% of clients, those treatments are really effective. That's why they have, if you go to the APA site, they have strong, they meet the category of strong empirical support. But that also means that for every 3 to 5 out of 10 clients that you see, for every 3 to 5 clients, it's not working. You're doing the best available treatment, and your client's not showing any response. And I've had clients who, one of my very first clients on internship was a client who was a firefighter in the Seattle Fire Department, went to go fight a fire at a warehouse. The second floor collapsed, and 3 of his friends and firefighters, they're kind of like the military, these were his brothers, he would call them, perished in the fire. He had a massive heart attack, was admitted to the University of Washington Medical Center, and was going to need a heart transplant, but he wasn't considered a good candidate for a heart transplant because he was clinically depressed. And in talking to him, first of all, I'm working with him in a hospital. It's hard to do a lot of behavioral activation in a hospital. Secondly, there were severe losses, right? And his cognitive processing wasn't that dysfunctional. He'd experienced some pretty horrific things and was really grieving that the life he lived that was for him a life of zest and very meaningful and full, he didn't think he was going to be able to, and he was realistic about this. He likely wasn't going to be able to be a firefighter again. So these models don't apply to everybody, but they're great places to start. But what I tell students is always from session 1 to begin developing a more individualized, idiographic, personalized model for each of your clients. And I have sheets that we track what thoughts our clients are having. We We track kind of their interpersonal interactions, and we try to identify what their goals are, what their standards are, and we gradually do that for a variety of reasons. So in Idiographic Theory, Muma is somebody who does a lot of work on clinical case conceptualization, is an idiographic theory of the person and his or her life situation, which includes problems as well as triggering and maintaining variables, including cognitions, thoughts and beliefs that have relevance for treatment planning for a particular individual. And again, we do this for several reasons. One is there's a chance that the treatment, even though it's got the strongest support that we're going to implement, is not going to be effective for the client. What do we do if that's the case? And by the way, you can predict that by, there have been several trials showing that if you're not seeing any reduction in depressive symptoms by session 5, and if you're implementing cognitive behavioral therapy skillfully and well, that's a big predictor of non-response to CBT. So you can know relatively early whether it's likely your client's going to respond or not. So that should be a warning. You know, that should be a moment where you really begin to really, work harder on developing your idiographic case conceptualization. Also, it's the case that there are several empirically supported treatments for major depressive disorder. If you do go to that APA website, you'll see that there are 4 treatments that have strong research support, meaning that there's independent labs that have done well-conducted, randomly controlled trial studies showing that the treatments are effective in treating depression. Which one do you use? There are treatments that just focus on behavioral activation. There are treatments that actually focus on self-regulation, focus on how goals are going. There are treatments that focus on coping and emotional processing. Which of those treatments do you use? And the idea being that if your client is not responding, maybe you consider, begin to consider implementing another evidence-based approach that's maybe more designed to target the variables you have, you've identified in your model as contributing to your client's depression. Another thing we see when you look at these studies that show treatments as empirically supported, what that means is that clients no longer meet criteria for the disorder by the end of the 20th session. They no longer are meeting criteria for major depressive disorder. That doesn't mean that clients are reporting everything's great. A number of clients continue to report pretty significant distress and some dysfunction that, although it doesn't meet criteria for major depressive disorder, they're feeling like they're not thriving. They're not doing as well as they'd like to do. And that's significant for a variety of reasons. One of the problems we have, and this is true for medication treatments for depression, this is true for cognitive behavioral therapy and other evidence-based therapies for depression. If you follow people out past a year, even the treatment responders are at high risk for relapse. And so, there's some evidence suggesting it's even more of a problem with antidepressants. But it's also a problem with cognitive behavioral therapy for depression as well. So, and the level of distress, the level of, even though it doesn't meet criteria, the level that the client is experiencing at the end of therapy predicts the likelihood of relapse, as you might imagine. So, what do you do about that? How do you treat and intervene with that? Another reason for developing this more personalized model of your clients is that there are empirically supported treatments don't exist for some disorders. We haven't, this is especially true for personality disorders, where we have long-standing patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that are contributing to significant distress and dysfunction that are the definition of the disorder. What do you do? Empirically supported treatments were also developed for single disorders. So we have, cognitive behavioral therapy for major depressive disorder. the reality is most clients present not with one disorder, but with multiple disorders. And it's the rule. Comorbidity is the rule. It's not the exception. And so how do you conceptualize someone? This is a quote from Jackie Persons, who's done a lot of work on case conceptualization. There will never be a protocol that specifies step by step an intervention plan for the African American veteran who has post-traumatic stress disorder, social phobia, alcohol abuse, depression, and who is afraid to acknowledge his homosexuality. You know, the complexity is the rule. We need to begin developing models of our clients that can conceptualize that complexity, so we can draw on treatment strategies in a more principled way to help our clients. I don't think clinical scientists have given enough attention to the role of long-standing patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving, personality, in developing the case conceptualizations. And I think if we systematically incorporate personality assessment into our idiographic case conceptualizations, we're going to have a more comprehensive, a more valid model of the person. And I think that would position the clinician to then provide personalized psychotherapy interventions that are tailored to that idiographic conceptualization. You know, and it's kind of a maxim that you want to intervene in a way that's going to have the maximum impact on your client's distress and dysfunction, and your idiographic conceptualization should provide a model of what are the variables that are most contributing to your client's difficulties. And I'll argue that a systematic assessment of personality better positions the client to make, the clinician to make those decisions. So we define personality as long-standing patterns, relatively enduring patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that characterize individuals in particular situations, that contributes to and indeed is sometimes equivalent to psychopathology. Obviously, if treatment planning is to meet or surpass the standards mandated by our field, then in clinical psychology, then the fundamental rule of treatment planning applies. The plan should be based on the best science available. So if we want to assess personality, we need to ask, what is personality, drawing upon the best personality science that's available. That's not happening in our field right now. There's the question that I just answered, but I don't think we're doing that very well. You know, actually in clinical practice, the trait approach is still very much alive and well. If in the rare cases that clinical scientists are looking to personality science for answers, they're more commonly, in terms of assessment, looking to the trait approach. And that's actually having some influence on the assessment of psychopathology and our official manual for diagnosing psychopathology. So, with the exception of traits, which are problematic for a number of reasons that you mostly already know, the cumulative developments in personality science over the last 50 years are essentially absent in the personality assessment instruments used by clinical psychologists. So we don't have good measures of the constructs that you hear social cognitive personality scientists talking about. We have some, and I'll talk about those, but not, you know, there aren't content valid, construct valid measures of self-schemata, I would argue. We have some measures for assessing goals that are pretty good, but I'll talk about what I think are some limitations tomorrow, and even some of those goal standard systems. Behavioral inhibition, temperament, I'll talk about that some tomorrow as well. These are affective motivational systems that are pretty well understood in terms of the neurological pathways that underlie them. They are person and context variables, so these behavioral inhibition systems aren't always activated. They're activated in situations of unfamiliarity, threat, challenge. But we don't. We have some good measures that researchers are using, but clinicians don't commonly use those measures, nor do they commonly use the good measures out there for assessing goal systems. This is a quote by someone who's involved in the personality assessment field. Personality assessors are using the equivalent of the first designs of the airplane flown by the Wright brothers. And there are surveys that show this. Here's a survey of practicing clinical psychologists, trying to assess what instruments are used most frequently by clinical psychologists. And the MMPI is, the winner. The MMPI was developed, the structural foundations of the MMPI, despite the fact that we now have the MMPI-2 and RF and MMPI-3 now, are the same, really, fundamentally as they were, with a few changes in the late 30s and 1940s when that instrument was developed. The Milan Clinical Multi-Axial Inventory, the Rorschach, other projective instruments, personality assessment inventory. These are what clinicians are using to assess personality. If you look at those instruments and you look at the scales, they're more commonly focused not on the assessment of personality, but on psychopathology. When they do assess personality, it's very much the case that they're either assessing trait-like constructs or psychopathological versions of the Big Five, or they're using contemporary personality construct names that you all might recognize as familiar, but actually lack content validity. And there's several examples of this. For self-beliefs and self-schemata, if you read MMPI-2 interpretation manuals, it tells you, two-point code types of 4884 or 6886. That's an indication of negatively valenced self-schemata. And low self-esteem. There's a low self-esteem scale. There's some content scales and other alienation and ego strength. Rorschach, if you see pairs in the figures, that gets coded as higher levels of self-worth. And if you see too many pairs, it's actually, the interpretation is supposed to be potential narcissistic personality disorder. There's no evidence that that's the case, but that's what clinicians are taught to do, and that's how they interpret it. There are bigger indexes that they draw on, but those scorings go into those bigger indexes for ego, for self-inflated kind of ego strength. Same thing with self-regulation. These are variables that are maybe familiar to us as people interested in social cognitive personality, but again, these code types lack content validity. There was a meta-analysis that looked at the MMPI 2-point codes and 3-point codes that are most commonly used to interpret personality. The average correlation with other measures of those constructs was like 0.14, so not good construct validity, but this is what clinicians use. And the same with the Rorschach, even worse cases with the Rorschach. Temperament, same issues. I say we're in a crisis because I don't know if this is happening in Brazil, but with insurance companies in the United States, it's hard to get paid as a clinician unless you're doing something that has some evidence of being effective. So insurance companies won't pay you for, Walter Mischel used, this example of he hoped that clinicians weren't like kids in a candy store and they just did whatever therapy they liked. It's hard to do that now with managed care because you have to have some evidence that what you're doing is an approach that has some efficacy. And I think increasingly what's going to happen in the States is that the scientific status of personality assessment is going to be necessary, and it's going to require evidence that personality assessments, one, lead to more valid case conceptualizations, and two, ultimately, better treatment outcomes. So in clinical science, what we're going to begin to see are these manipulated assessment designs where Some clients get a personality assessment, other clients do not get a personality assessment, and the big question is, do the clients that get the personality assessment, do they get better sooner? Is treatment more effective? Currently, there's no evidence that the personality assessment instruments that we're using meet any of these requirements. And I think, if you look at the time clinical psychologists are spending doing personality assessment, it's diminishing. 1959, clinicians were reporting that almost 45% of their time in practice was spent doing assessments. That went down in 1969. I don't know if you can read the numbers, they're pretty small. It went down in 1982, and in 2009, the last column there was the last time they did the survey. So clinicians are doing personality assessments less and less, and I think when they are doing it, unfortunately, even though there's no evidence that the personality assessment approaches and instruments we all learned in graduate school aren't effective, we use those because that's the only thing we know. Safety exists in the use of traditional tests, especially if there's no viable alternative that exists. So I think this is really problematic. Again, I think the way forward is to, if you want to assess personality, ask from a contemporary personality science perspective, what is it? And that should be driving how you go about assessing it. By the way, I don't know if I didn't say this, but I didn't get any questions, but I'm happy during this presentation also, if someone has a question, feel free to raise your hand. We can make this more of a discussion. Dan has said, rightly, I think, and I think you also said this in the chapter of Walter Mischel, social cognitive theory can provide a forum for integrating the science of persons, and in terms of what are the structures, what are the components in the individual, and what are the processes that explain personality. And here's a graph to kind of show this. I mean, I remember this was at the Social and Personality Conference that Dan, I think you were involved in putting together. There was a pre-personality conference where there were, people that would not identify themselves as personality scientists. They were outside personality, but multiple different disciplines presenting data and presenting research that was relevant to the questions that personality scientists are interested in. So, neuroscience, social, cultural, cognitive, developmental, clinical. It's not as if Bandura and Mischel or Dan, did all the work that identified these constructs they're using. They're drawing from the field broadly, from psychological science broadly, and organizing it in a way that I think is really useful because it's a place you can look at for what is personality. And that science, which again is across subdisciplines in psych science, informs our understanding of how beliefs are represented in memory, how they are activated or primed. Same thing with goals, standards, and I'm going to argue, and I'm not, both Dan and Walter Mischel have explicitly acknowledged the possibility that there are these affective, temperament-like systems that are also exist that could account for individual differences. That first slide I showed you, by the way, of the kids looking at the moment the dragon was slain in the puppet show, I think it's a good illustration of temperament. Just kind of these, very immediate kind of effective reactions to stimuli. So if social cognitive theory is the best place to go for answers about what is personality and how should we assess it, where is it? And clinicians right now, when we are taught to do both cognitive assessment and personality assessment, there's a number of standard textbooks that people use, including in my graduate program, where I'm at now. In none of these books is there a chapter on social cognitive personality assessment. Doesn't exist. Even in, theory organized, so these personality textbooks that organize approaches to personality assessment by theory, they cover a broad range of theories, including psychodynamic, interpersonal theory, personological, five-factor model, empirical, and therapeutic assessments, kind of an approach that combines a number of, in a collaborative way with the client, a number of different approaches, but not social cognitive. It just doesn't exist. Odd, because here's one of the two most prominent frameworks in contemporary personality science, completely non-existent in the textbooks we used, the clinicians used to practice personality assessment. I think there's a number of reasons why that might be the case, but it's not because, and I think Dan alluded to this earlier, it's not because Al Bandura or Walter Mischel were uninterested in applying social cognitive theory to improving human life. In fact, they were explicitly interested in that. Both of them had some clinical backgrounds and experiences. And Walter Mischel's book, Personality Assessment, which unfortunately is often misinterpreted as arguing there was no personality. In fact, as Dan described, the whole second half of the book was about an alternative approach to assessing personality. And in fact, in that second half of the book, Walter Mischel tries to illustrate integrating what then was kind of the cutting edge of social learning theory, drawing on that to conceptualize the case of Pearson Brock, who was a flyer in World War II who had developed a sudden fainting problem. And Walter Mischel provides a case conceptualization, an idiographic case conceptualization of Pearson Brock, drawing on what then was the best science. Given the tremendous advancements in the understanding of the basic cognitive and affective mechanisms that contribute to personality, the advancements that have occurred since 1968, the gap between knowledge and practice has only, I think, widened tremendously. And again, I would argue that in clinical practice, there's no wider gap than between the science and the practice than there is in assessing personality, which is, we're treating persons. And yes, we have some treatments that are effective, but they're not optimally effective. Why? Why is this the case? Why don't we see social cognitive methods of personality assessment? I think it's hard. It's easy to do the Big Five assessment. You just throw a trait measure in front of the client. It's not as clear how to do a comprehensive assessment of the person from a social cognitive perspective. Dan pointed this out when he first, I think, was describing the Kappa model. Social cognitive theory does not sufficiently differentiate or specify what it is we should measure, the personality structures and processes at a level that can be easily translated into measurement. Dan went over these, but it's not clear symbolizing personal capability, how one, it's a meta theory, so it's intended, to help researchers, but it's not at a level that it's going to make it easy to translate into personality assessment. Also, these variables, as Dan points out, overlap. There's no principled basis for the distinctions that are made. And key is there's no distinction between personality structures, relatively enduring components in the person that are causing the person or influencing how that person thinks, feels, and behaves, and personality processes, more dynamic patterns of appraisal, thinking, feeling that characterize the person. So I do think, Dan's Kappa model really provides a promising step forward by specifying in a principled way these personality variables of beliefs, goals, and standards, and distinguishing between structures and processes. There's a clear path to developing more, social cognitive personality assessment approaches that can be implemented. Not only that, Dan's kappa model is a path, it's a contribution in that sense, but Dan, along with Bill Shadle and Simon Gensius, specified principles that we need to keep in mind as we're trying to apply. So we have an idea of what to measure, but how we should measure it. It's a pretty clear roadmap. We need to, there's 5 principles. One is distinguish between assessment of internal personality structures and dynamics and the assessment of overt behavioral tendencies. There's a number of studies published in really decent clinical science outlets that, inform us that trait neuroticism, low agreeableness, low conscientiousness is associated with a lot of psychopathology. As a clinician, to know that my client who's experiencing, by definition of depression is you're experiencing sadness most of the day, nearly every day. You're not feeling like you're enjoying things that you used to enjoy. You have a sense of hopelessness. If you look at measures of neuroticism, it's some of the same items. I often feel blue. It's a neuroticism item on some of the big 5 scales. But if you look at those neuroticism measures, they also combine items that are getting at thinking. There's things aren't going to get any better. Feelings, feeling blue, and behaviors. That's not distinguishing potentially between internal structures, dynamics, and the assessment of overt behavioral tendencies. Second principle is assess personal determinants of action, the knowledge, beliefs, goals, and self-regulatory skills through which people contribute to their own development. They should be things that actually exist in the person and that positively influence how that person thinks, feels, and behaves. Dan alluded, the big 5 doesn't replicate in individuals. Those constructs were identified, and not always, apparently, in populations. But if you look within the individual, we don't replicate those big 5. Keep separate response systems separate. Kind of talked about that a little bit already, but with the neuroticism measure, combining items that capture thoughts, feelings, and behaviors into overall index of neuroticism doesn't allow you to look at functional relationships between those thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And employ assessments that are sensitive to the qualities of the unique individual. Tomorrow, when I describe the personality assessment method that we've been developing in our lab for the last 8 years or so, they have idiographic components and nomothetic components. So, for example, the goal measure, which we adapted a goal measure that is used by other goal researchers, has the client think about what they do behaviorally in a number of different life domains, intimate relationships, non-intimate relationships, leisure activities. They write brief descriptions of their behaviors in each of these different life domains first, and then we ask them whether they think they have a goal in any of these domains, and we have an other domain category that can be anything. So potentially clients can identify any goal that can be very unique, I want to get better at Travis-style guitar picking. That could be someone's goal. So that's the idiographic component of our assessments, but then we ask some items that get at how the client thinks about the goal, in terms of how confident are they that they can execute the behaviors required to make the goal happen, and self-efficacy item, whether they view that goal as something that is appetitive, that they approach, or something that is aversive, that they avoid. I did some work for a number of years in Wyoming on the Wind River Indian Reservation with the Northern Arapaho tribe, and we published a lot on kids' goals on that reservation, and there were a lot of aversive goals, like I don't I don't want to be homeless. I don't want to end up like my dad or my uncle. Those are avoidant goal orientations, and there's a lot of research showing that these approach avoidant goal dimensions are important. And those are nomothetic items. We ask those items, no matter what goal you list, we ask those items that are based on theory in terms of how different goal dimensions impact motivation, affect, performance. Finally, assess persons in context. The personality structures that we're assessing are domain linked. So they're specific goals about a specific life area. When I get to the relational schema measure, that we've been working on, there are thoughts about the self that come to mind when you're with your mother, thoughts that come to mind when you're with your partner, thoughts that come to mind when you're with your friend. And the information about the self that comes to mind is not always overlapping, and I'll talk about that. There's a lot of within-person variation in self-schema content, depending upon what context you prime in the person. So assess persons in context. Well, we should just stop. Dan's done everything. He's told us what to measure. He's told us how to measure it. Why did you invite me to give a talk? You could just had I do think there's, especially in clinical context, a need for measure development, and especially a need to develop more content-valid measures. Content validity refers to the degree to which elements of an assessment instrument are relevant to and representative of the targeted construct for a particular assessment purpose. This may not be as much of a problem in personality research. It's a tremendous problem in clinical personality assessment. The instruments we use, even the ones that have labels that look like some of the constructs personality researchers are working on, are not relevant to, not representative of those constructs as we understand them. So it's a major problem. And here's content validity evolves. It should evolve. Constructs evolve. Our understanding, and I'll point this out here in a minute, our understanding of self-schemata has changed since Marcus in 1977 came out with their self-schema paper. There's different, it's become more elaborate. Our measures need to kind of reflect the dynamic nature of the constructs as they're understood today. Most of our clinical assessment, personality assessment instruments, again, were developed in the 1930s, 1940s. And some developed more recently, but those, again, are more focused often on psychopathology and more trait-like construct assessment. So content validity of measures are necessarily going to degrade over time. If you're using the same measures to assess self-schemata that you're using 50 years ago, I think it's legitimate to ask, are you really measuring self-schemata in a content-valid way? The rest of my talk today is going to be focused on the assessment of beliefs. These are the three variables kind of delineated by Dan's Kappa model. But beliefs, as Dan defines them, are mental propositions that are either true or false with regard to actual states in the world. I am Brazilian! Yeah. You would say, no, that's not right, Walt. But these are, in Dan's approach, well, I'll come to that in a moment, but in the clinical world, we talk about, people develop beliefs about all kinds of things, themselves, surely, others, their worlds. In the context of clinical personality assessment, which beliefs do we assess? So that's another, some work that has to be done is figuring out that. In Dan's approach, he's been, here's some other beliefs about others: hostile attributional bias, stereotypes, person schemata, role schemata. The world, we have just world, these are just some examples. But in clinical context, we do have self-schema measures, quote unquote. The two most frequently used self-schema measures in clinical personality assessment are the dysfunctional attitude scale and the early maladaptive schema that Jeff Young has developed. Other clinical measures are sociotropy, autonomy, but of course there are other self-beliefs. In Dan's work, he's been assessing, self-schemata, looking at personal strengths and personal weaknesses using an open, writing kind of narrative, and we actually incorporate that as well in our assessment of schemata. But we also incorporate some other measures in our approach that aim to kind of reflect the self-schema's construct as it has evolved. So here's Marcus's original definition of a self-schema, and they were defined as cognitive generalizations about the self derived from past experience that organize and guide the processing of self-related information contained in the individual's social experience. The idea of looking at the self as a cognitive structure like we view other beliefs, that was very generative in terms of people doing research. It very soon evolved. In Marcus in 1987 was describing self-schema as a collection of self-representations. And the working self-concept is that subset of representations which is accessible at a given moment. So we now are talking about multiple self-representations with the context priming and making accessible and working memory, any given self-schema in the moment. As personality, scientists and clinicians, we're interested in self-schemata that are chronically accessible, that easily come to mind, and that have a large influence on that person's thinking, feeling, and behaving. But it evolved even further. Baldwin in 1992 did some research and described self-schema construct as, and he actually referred to it as the relational schema construct, but hypothesized that they included images not just of self, but of the other, along with a script for an expected pattern of interaction derived from generalization from repeated similar interpersonal experiences. So now we have a self-schema construct that is now including knowledge representations of others, along with kind of the Abelson script construct, what typically happens when we're with that other. Ogilvy, self with other representation presumes that we not only create internal mental representations of others and images of self in different roles and undertakings, but that we also form mental representations of self as experienced in the company of specific others. Anderson and Chin, a set of relational selves, each embodying the relatively unique self one experiences in relation to a significant other, including the typical relationship patterns between self and other. So again, this idea of the structure of the self-schema, including representations of others, representations of scripts. McConnell, the self is a collection of multiple context-dependent self-aspects that are associated with personal attributes. And this is, a wide perspective, a widely held perspective among self-researchers. And for similar views, you can look at these references, including Martin Conway, who's, is he a cognitive? I think he's a cognitive psychologist, studies memory. Fraley, who studies attachment, recognizes that we have multiple attachment representations depending upon context. So this is an example of how science evolves, our understanding of constructs evolve. Certainly our understanding of self-schemata has evolved over the last 50 years. Or almost 50 years. We now there's a number of people view it as a cognitive representation that includes a family of selves. And it's relational. The self is entangled. Our memory representations have associative links to representations of others. James, like a lot of things, said this even back in 1890, an individual has as many different social selves as there are distinct groups of persons about whose opinion he cares. So, ask yourself, like if you could imagine, in these experiments, some of the ones that Baldwin does, he'll have you visualize a typical interaction with your mom or with somebody else, and ask yourself, do you think the same information about the self would come to mind in each of those contexts? Some information might. There might be some similarity, but likely there's going to be some distinctive content about the self that becomes accessible. So here's a graphic representation of the self-schema construct. The interpersonal script, there's Susan Chin has talked about the interpersonal script end goal. And there have been some other self-researchers arguing that not only do we have representations of the self that are associatively linked to specific others, but also expectations about what typically happens when we're with that other person, as well as what we're trying to do, typically. So, do our current assessment instruments of self-schemata, especially in clinical contexts, are they content valid? Are they representing the self-schema construct in a way that is relevant to and representative of the target construct? I don't think so. Most self-schema measures, particularly in clinical contexts, assess the self as a unitary, single cognitive, monolithic cognitive structure about the self in general, unlinked to context. The dysfunctional attitude scale is an example of that. As I said, it's probably one of the most frequently used measures in clinical research and in by some clinicians with a cognitive bent in clinical practice. It asks about beliefs about the self in general, maladaptive self-beliefs, like if I fail partly, it says it is as bad as a complete failure. It doesn't ask if this belief comes to mind in particular role contexts or with particular others, it just asks this in general. And it really, there's kind of two factors that emerge in the dysfunctional attitude scale. One that kind of gets at perfectionistic standards for performance, and another that gets at self-worth contingent beliefs in general, but they're in general, right? And I can be perfectionistic about some things, but other things, my wife would clearly attest to this. She would like to see me more perfectionistic. The argument is that these kinds of beliefs about the self might be also very contextually dependent, but the dysfunctional attitude scale doesn't get at content about the self by priming the full self-schema structure. So the way to do that would be to think of yourself in important interpersonal context, thinking about what you typically do, the script, thinking about the particular role of a particular other, the context in which this is happening, and then assessing what information about the self comes to mind. The Young Schema Questionnaire, as I said, is another measure that's used a lot by clinicians now to assess self-schemata. And it's, again, the items are things like I don't fit in, no man or woman I desire could love me once he or she saw my defects. Doesn't ask the extent to which these beliefs are present with specific others, roles or contexts. It's limited to beliefs about rejection. There's a number of different Young Schema Questionnaire scales, but each of them is about that content in general, not in a specific relational context. So we're going to take a break now, I think. Is that about the right time? Half an hour?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, half an hour before the break.
Yeah.
Okay, well, maybe I'll keep talking then. Let me ask you at this point.
Can I make a question?
Yeah.
Well, I have one. There is no online questions, and if someone else has, I can bring the microphone as well. So Val, I'm still back a few slides thinking about decreasing the personality assessment. I'm wondering, is that because, for example, nowadays we are very specialized in doing stuff, so we don't look a person as a whole, but we look whether the person is depressed, and then we just assess depression, and give an intervention, medication, and whatever, and then we don't consider that anymore as a personality assessment. Whereas back in the days, perhaps all these assessment would be more related to the person itself than actually a specific, depression, bipolar, or whatever. Does that make sense?
I think, if I understand you correctly, there are times where we aren't right, especially with managed care, there's emphasis on being efficient and assessing personality is non-essential. Especially if you begin with the normative case conceptualization and you just do CBT progression, it works. There's no need to assess personality. I think we need to improve our treatments, and we have a number of treatments a number of clients who are doing our treatments over, and they're often the same clients who have ingrained, long-standing patterns of thinking and behaving that are, in some cases, actually beside the quality that we're trying to treat, but in other cases, there are patterns that are occurring in very specific situational contexts that are contributing to their distress and dysfunction. And if we just view our client as a depressed person and don't systematically gather information about those personality signatures, those patterns of thinking and behaving that happen in very specific contexts, those patterns, those different patterns are going to continue. And when it's going to continue to struggle. Distress and dysfunction. So I guess there's some cases where clearly we don't bother with doing personality assessments, but there are other cases, especially with comorbid personality disorders. So we have someone presenting with major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and they also are showing long-standing patterns of emotional instability, fears of abandonment, difficulties regulating anger, borderline personality disorder, those kind of, and in fact, those long-standing patterns are contributing to relationship difficulties, performing on the work. We need to, I would argue, use confrontive, systematic, comprehensive personality assessments to get a picture of what's going on in order to be able to treat it. Is that what you were asking?
Yeah, it is. I'm just, if we, let's take Brazil as an example. We still use psychoanalysis, all these sort of things. Then the personality assessment for them is, the projective testing, all these sort of things. But in Europe, United States, it's not used that often anymore. So I guess the decrease of using, personality assessment might be related to also using, not using psychoanalysis, for example, or other type of variables, and then starting this new movement, perhaps not new, right? Started in the 60s, I guess, right then, so not that new. But how can, I'm just trying to look the connections between why personality assessment has been decreasing, whereas now we have more evidence of how to do a better job and why it is important.
So why is it that we used to be doing these personality assessments more and we're doing it less now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I think there is, especially amongst more scientifically minded clinical practitioners. So in the United States, we have a model of clinical training. It's called the scientist practitioner model. Most universities, that are public universities that have clinical psych PhD programs kind of adopt this. It's called the Boulder model. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but we're training our clinicians both as scientists and practitioners. And the idea is science-informed practice, practice-informed science. Clinicians that come out of those training programs don't do personality assessments because they know the science on the personality assessment tools that are available, and they know they're not good. So yeah, I recognize that it's important. I know obviously personality is contributing to my clients' difficulties and their distress, but we don't have anything that's valid. We don't have anything to use that has any credible evidence of being useful. So, and oftentimes the clinicians that come out of those scientist practitioner programs are often the leaders, the directors of clinics, or so I think that's going on. I think the other thing that's going on is you want to get paid for what you do. Administering a Rorschach takes it's a bit of work. You have to, administer the Rorschach. You have to interpret it. It takes time, and you want to get paid for your time. It's getting increasingly difficult to get paid for your time administering a Rorschach, at least in the United States. The MMPI, again, I still have students writing psychological assessment reports that, it's really hard for me to think of many cases in which the results yielded by the MMPI-2 revealed anything interesting that I didn't already know. Oftentimes in our intake procedure, we usually do a semi-structured interview, and we got a pretty good sense of the client's distress and dysfunction, and what's most kind of distressing, what's most dysfunctional, and we have our labels for those patterns, and we also usually administer some objective personality assessment test. Most clinics do this. The other one's the personality assessment inventory. But again, the results from those instruments don't really give us much for the effort that's required to administer those instruments. The MMPI takes about 45 minutes to complete. You have to pay for this report that gets generated. And then the interpretation is very complex. Like you can look at the 2-point and 3-point code types. Then you're supposed to look, because they've cleaned this up somewhat. A lot of the scales are correlated with each other because of this general distress factor that cuts across all the scales. But then to interpret a particular code type, to really interpret it well, the items are so heterogeneous within the different scales. You have to look at the critical items within the scales to make sense of why someone scored high on an 8 scale, for example. So now you've got to spend time looking at the critical items and reading, it's a lot of effort. And I don't think the effort is justifying the amount of information you're getting that's useful. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Any other
Yeah.
questions? Yeah.
Yeah. I was wondering here when we talk.
So online people can hear. So I'm going to get started.
It's going to reduce my self-efficacy now, but Professor, I was wondering while you're talking, is there any possibilities to group types of personality by maladaptive self-structures? Grouping different types of personality by maladaptive self-structures, like failure or shame. I was wondering while you're talking if there is any possibility to group these types of personality by the Jeffrey Young's maladaptives.
I think that's an interesting question. And I think that may be the case, that there are similar patterns. Like there are, a good example of this is research looking at rejection sensitivity. There are a group of people who, in ambivalent interpersonal situations, most of us might approach interpersonal situations with like, oh, this might be interesting, or this might be boring, or people high in rejection sensitivity approach interpersonal situations kind of scanning the social environment for signs that they're being rejected. And so interpersonal situations for them, especially if they're not familiar people, they're not family or friends, are threatening, and they're constantly scanning their perceptual world for signs that they're being rejected. And they show, so they have those kinds of thoughts, and there's, you know, and there's, it's a useful program of research because you can identify groups of people who in ambiguous social situations are quick, ready to perceive interpersonal rejection. They experience common affective states. They feel hurt, they want to withdraw, they feel angry, they want to, you know, attack verbally, and they experience a lot of rejection interpersonally. It becomes a vicious cycle. Anticipating rejection, they may avoid social interactions, not develop as much social skills, things don't go as well. So I do think that there could be emergent kind of response classes where similar structures are being activated for certain people. Certain self-schemata are being activated and that are in common somewhat, and leading to similar patterns of thinking, feeling, behaving. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay.
I think we're good there.
Yeah. So we're working on developing a new self-schema measure. What we did some preliminary work, well, where we had people basically write names of people that they most thought about or most interacted with in different kind of interpersonal categories like close friends or partners or parents, siblings, and we also solicited roles that were the roles that they were most frequently in. So they identify these targets, and again, they're 10 most, kind of either frequently thought about targets or contexts that they're frequently in and interacting in. And what we did is we had for each relational context, the participant visualize the self in a typical interaction. We used a script that Baldwin has used in his research on relational schema. So you actually form a mental picture of the person's face, and you are asked to kind of visualize a typical interaction in sequence, and there's a set of instructions that go with that. And then we had participants write open-ended descriptions of what they're typically doing, what typically happens when you're with this person or in this role. What are the sequence of events? What is it that you're typically trying to do? And we also, at the end, had them list several adjectives that came to mind that kind of describe the self in those interactions. When we looked at that, we observed, here's the problem. Clinicians don't have the time to code. Coding is very difficult. To code open-ended scripts for different things. So we were trying to develop an instrument that would kind of capture in a more content-valid way the schema construct that didn't require coding. So participants, we saw strong themes of connection or disconnection, like, and I'll give some examples of this, competence or incompetence, autonomy or feeling like you're being coerced or controlled in situations. So here's an example. This was a woman who envisioned herself with her boyfriend, and a typical script, this is what she wrote. My boyfriend and I live together, so our typical interactions start with asking how each of our days have been. We usually kiss or hug when we greet each other. We share meals together often and also find ourselves doing homework together or snuggling while watching a movie. So that's a typical sort of thing that happens with her boyfriend. Her typical goal, she described as to connect, to feel closer, to give and get support from this person. Self-descriptive adjectives were loved, accepted. So obviously, strong themes of relatedness, connection there. With another participant, they envisioned their self with grandmother. Typical script was, we talk to each other on the phone, and I discuss my school grades and talk about what I need to improve. She gives me advice, is often critical of me. Typical goal is to try to impress her, to try to get good grades and get her respect. Self-descriptive adjectives, though, pretty negatively valenced. Not good enough, failure, young. So we didn't go into this, honestly, expecting for that content. We were just, I was interested in what content emerges about the self when you have people visualize the self in different relational contexts, different role contexts. What are the typical, is there some way of coding this? Are there themes that emerge in people's content? Although we didn't expect it, there are other research who study the self who would. I think there's problems with the psychological need construct, but there are these theorists who, well, Anderson's not one of them, but she argued that basic psychological needs for human connection, competence, or mastery may be stored as part of our relational selves. That was, I think, a psych review paper. Carol Dweck, we have built-in attentional mechanisms, built-in inferential and representational abilities that orient self towards basic psychological needs of acceptance, competence, and predictability. That's paraphrasing there, but that's essentially what she was saying. Certainly, DC and Ryan, the self-determination theorists would argue this, and they have a paper on multiple selves and that makes this point. People have many identities, for example, as parent, employee, spouse, friend, patient, religious devotee, conservative or liberal, and many more, rather than just a single identity, that optimally allow fulfillment of the psychological needs for relatedness, competence, and autonomy. So the idea here is they're arguing that our self-memory systems orient to representations of how we fit in or do not fit in, relatedness themes, what we're good at or bad at, competence themes, what interests or disinterests us, thereby becoming infused into the self-memory structure. Using this pilot data, and then consulting, self-determination theories, definitions of these three psychological needs, we created a coding manual that we actually borrowed a fair amount from Dan McAdams, who does, does this life story interview where he has to code people's narrative responses describing the self. We started with that, and then using DC and Ryan's definitions, ended up starting with that, but then adding to it, modifying it, coming up with a coding manual that we experimented with, and we're able to get raters to independently, agree with one another. And we did the same. We did a study where we used the same basic procedure I described in the preliminary work, where we had folks identify their most accessible relational schemata. From a personality perspective, the goal is to identify self-representations that are relatively enduring, that actually exist in the person's mind, that come to mind most frequently, that are most accessible. So we tried to identify their most accessible relational schemata, and by that we identified the others or the roles that they most thought about or most were frequently in, or the others they were most frequently interacting with. And they brainstorm and list a bunch of targets, and then they pick a subset of those as the ones that are most frequently interacted with or thought about. We had them imagine a typical interaction, and again write open-ended descriptions of typical scripts and goals for each self. They listed self-descriptive adjectives, and we also had items that for each relational schema we asked how confident they were that they could perform the behaviors that would for their goal that they listed. They wrote an open-ended description of the goal, typical goal, and we asked them to rate their efficacy for being able to enact the behaviors that would enable them to reach that goal. They also listed self-descriptive, rated items for self-valence, how good or bad they felt about the self in the interaction. And connection, how connected or disconnected, close or rejected or distant did they experience the interaction. We also had them complete some standard schema measures that are used in the clinical literature a fair amount. The early maladaptive schema measure. We actually used both dysfunctional attitude scale and the Young's measure. Measures of rejection, sensitivity, and some traits. Here were the targets that came up most frequently. These were college students, young, average age was just under 20. And the most frequent targets that came, we coded, by the way, the targets. So I had a coding manual that listed, I think it was 36 different targets and roles. The raters were trained to, and there was high agreement on rating the targets especially. They were, and self with friend came up most frequently, self with mother next, self with father, so you can just read down the list, sibling, partner, grandmother, relative, ex-partner. We also asked, for each of these targets, how frequently they thought about the person. 2 on this scale, you can look at the accessibility column there. 2 would be once every week or so. 3 is once every day. So they're reporting for these, certainly for the, for most of the targets there, thinking about the target at least once every day. For partner, multiple times a day. And then also assessed valence, how good or bad they experienced the self in that interaction. We remember they also wrote self-descriptive adjectives, and I'll talk about that in a moment. We had coders code the valence of those self-descriptive adjectives, and we calculated a valence ratio, so the ratio of good to bad self-descriptive adjectives for each schema. But here you can see that people are recalling self-representations in which they feel good about the self. I actually think that might be, in clinical context, it might be important to have some targets where the self, where you don't explicitly pull for when the self feels threatened, but that's not what people are reporting when you just ask them to list the people they most interact with or most think about. These are roles. People could list self with others, but they could also list self as professor, self as student. None of them were professors. So they could list other. By the way, I should take everybody. We signed one target for everyone. All participants were told to complete the responses for self as student. They were all undergraduate students, so this was a role that they all had. So if you were studying medical, physicians, you could do this for self as physician or something. But you can see again that generally people are, these are pretty accessible self-representations. They're coming to mind every day, sometimes multiple times a day. And in general, they're feeling pretty good about the self in these roles. The lowest, I think, is self as student. All right, you know what? Let's stop there. It's not a clean break, but we'll just continue with what I'm going to do the rest of the day is describe the study. There's one more study where we actually developed items and it's the relational self-schema measure that's now published in the journal Personality Assessment. So it's a measure that I'm hoping that's practical that clinicians can actually use to come up with more content now on assessing self-schema. So that's where we're headed today. Thank you.